Everything is personal right here. Everything is personal right here.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Everything is Personal. I'm really excited to have our guest on, who's Dr. David Rabin, who's the founder and co-inventor at Apollo Neurosciences. And I'm actually wearing the device, and I appreciate you guys. I see that. I appreciate you guys sending me this version. So, David, thank you for being on, and I really appreciate it. Before we get into the device and all that stuff, I want to really learn a little bit more about you. I've been, doing some research and getting into your content a little bit, and which is fantastic. And you have some amazing content. But I don't know if anybody's been asking you about your own personal history. So I'm curious about that. So first, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Mill Valley, California. We traveled around a bit as a family, but mostly in Mill Valley, California, which is just north of San Francisco.
Got it. It's interesting. So my family name on my mother's side is Rabin. And,
oh, really?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, and they came from, I guess, parts of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine and all these other places, immigrated over. So if there was a DNA test, maybe we can check if we're related some way.
Yeah, right. You never know.
And so what was your childhood like? Are you, do you have siblings? Were your parents together?
Yeah, I have my two younger brothers. I'm the oldest of three. One of my middle brother is 2.5 years younger than me. My youngest brother is 7 years younger than me. And our parents, we were raised by two very loving parents in Mill Valley. My mom is a neurologist who specializes in movement disorders. My dad is an ophthalmologist who is also originally trained as an engineer. And so there was always this kind, and they were two amongst the first people of their families to go to college and to actually pursue higher education and graduate level education. And so I think, for them, coming from the first generation of Jews born in America after the Holocaust, there was this huge drive to succeed. And in a way that benefits society and in a way that is charitable, but that also integrates this really healthy sense of discovery and passion and joy for what we do. And just, as hard as we may work, still doing what we can to preserve that sense of joy. And so, and especially around discovery. And so both my parents had also done research in the past at different times of their lives. And so, I was definitely a why child growing up, asking why a lot, and always trying to figure out how things worked.
It's funny, maybe we are related. Maybe it's genetic, because I was the why guy in my family too. My dad was an engineer. My mom was more on the accounting side. But I find it fascinating. I wasn't born in this country. I immigrated when I was 6 years old from Lithuania, from the old Soviet Union too. And like I said, my family came from Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and that area. But I agree with you. There's a certain sense of discovery and contribution. It's like they wanted to pursue better things and also share those things. So when you were growing up with that, was that a motivator for you? Like, I'm trying to figure out your path and your journey to get like, all right, so I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be a psychiatrist, or maybe I'll be both.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I can walk you through the story. So that was a core part of it, right? That environment that my parents kindly laid out for us, that embodied these values that we were just talking about, especially around discovery and charity and giving back. And in Jewish culture, we call it like a mitzvah, right? So this is it's one of the things that's the best things that we can do in our lives is to give back to other people. And so that really stuck with me. It laid a really nice foundation. I spent a couple of years in Hebrew school growing up. I think that also, actually left a really nice layer of foundation on that culturally and helped me connect with my own culture better. And then, that environment combined with growing up having very vivid dreams as a very young child, as long as I can remember back to maybe, I think my earliest memories are from very few, from 2 years old. So it was probably around like 4 or 5 that I started to have these very vivid dreams that were not always bad or good. Sometimes they were just neutral, but they were things that I would then reference later in conversation with people. And I would realize very quickly when they gave me like a quizzical look, suggesting that they did not remember the events that I was alluding to, that this was something that actually might have happened in a dream, not in this reality. So I started asking people, and my parents were the smartest people that I knew, and I was a little kid, and who else would you go to? So you ask your parents, and and so my parents said, well, dreams aren't real. They're these things that happen when we sleep, and they're not real. They can't hurt you, et cetera, et cetera. But that was it. That was the explanation for the most part that I remember, and that never really sat with me well, and never really left me satisfied, because ultimately I continued to have these dreams, and these dreams continue to feel extraordinarily real. They continue to feel as real as this conversation we're having right now. And so as a little kid, you start to wonder, well, what is real, right? What is that word that we use to describe real actually mean if I feel it in these two different situations? And the experts around me say, even as a young kid, right, you can kind of start to ask these questions. Like, the experts around me are saying this isn't real. Subconsciously, there's a part of us that's like, okay, well, then what is real?
Right.
And that kind of that was the spark, I think, that really kicked off in me this drive to try to understand what is real and what is consciousness, and how do we think about the world and make meaning of the world, and how does the way we use words influence that, and how does the way that we interact with each other influence that, and how does that tie back to the neurobiology and the neurochemistry and the drugs and all of it. So
it's really interesting because I can't say that I had vivid dreams that I remember all the time. I don't remember a lot of my dreams, but there's been situations in my life where I was having conversations with people, and sometimes I feel like I am watching myself have a conversation with somebody, and I'm in a different sort of, and by the way, through taking psychedelics and all these other things, I started getting a better perception that everything that we just see is not everything that we see that really exists. So it made sense. But as a kid, as you're getting through that, was a desire to sort of let me dig into this brain and see what's going on in the brain, or is it because there's all these things that I can see the dreams, but let me take it apart and see, is there a part that's happening? Was that the motivator to kind of pursue that?
Yeah, I think there was always a how it works kind of background, because that was just how I was raised. So yes, but I think for a long time as a kid, I didn't really know what the brain was, right? I think I don't recall actually having a concept of brain as in this organ inside our heads with all these neurons that talk to each other and learn things and convey and information and hold our sense of self and blah, 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 right? I didn't have any understanding of any of that or what that meant until maybe 8 or 10 years old. So I think at first it was really just an interest in experience, right? And understanding like what is lived experience as a child. And I was very fortunate to have an environment that was safe for the most part, short of a little bit of bullying, but safe to experience that in. And, I think that really helped me understand, a framework for, how do you how do you go from here? And then when I got old enough to start to understand the brain and what the brain was, I could start to put the pieces together. And then,
right.
But I think even throughout, I've been in a lot of school, I've been in more school than most people ever go to. And, because the college and then medical school and graduate school and residency, and and I don't think it was even until the end of medical school or mid-graduate school, probably 6 years after college, that I read Eric Kandel's book, which was In Search of Memory, his autobiography about how his experiences with trauma and the Holocaust, and then leading to him ultimately winning the Nobel Prize for discovering how we learn and remember, and that actually goes all the way down into the center of the cell and how the cell works. And it is encoded over a long period of time. And it extends back as a mechanism of memory 300 million years to ancient sea snails.
Yeah.
And I never learned about that in that way in medical school or college or graduate school, to the point where I could, grok it like that. And then I read that book and I was like, wow, this is it. It just integrated all those pieces together. And I was like, okay, this is how memory works, right? I have this understanding. And then that led me on this much deeper mission of trying to figure out how the brain works with the body and how we can optimize that relationship between the mind and the body to get our stuff done, to sleep better, to focus better, and to improve our quality of life.
I love that story. Let me take a step back, and I want to understand, because your focus was or is on chronic stress as part of so growing up, and you mentioned bullying, for instance, was there a level of stress that you thought that you were going through? And I'm trying to get the core. Yes, everybody has stress, and I'm a big believer that stress creates an inflammation and cortisol, and it triggers all these disease predispositions. That's what everything I've ever read and everything I've experienced. And my mom always told me, stress is your number one thing. But I'm the why guy. I'm like, oh yes, but how? Why is it? So digging a little bit deeper was interesting to me. But did you have your own personal experience with stress that sort of kind of led you down that path as well?
Oh yeah, many. I think the first one was just from a young age, in growing up in our community, in the way that schools were when we were growing up, which isn't that different from the way they are now, except they're much more cyber now than they were then. But kids picked on each other and bullied each other, and it was mostly in just good fun, but you don't really recognize that when you're a little kid. And so as a kid, feeling excluded and feeling like you're not part of the group, or you're lesser than the other kids, I think is a huge stressor for all kids out there, for anyone really. We all need to feel accepted by our community, but for kids in our emotional prime, our emotional development years, especially during elementary, adolescence, these times, and younger, all school ages really, this is a critical time where kids need to feel safe. We need to feel safe emotionally, physically, and mentally, spiritually, et cetera, to explore what it is that we actually, as children, want to do with our lives when we grow up, right? Otherwise, if we have the stress of bullying, or stress of being picked on, or all of these pressure with what college we get into and what other people are going to think of us when we graduate, and will we ever be able to get the exact job that we want, then we actually are clouding the child's ability. Our own ability even was clouded to figure out, what is it exactly that I want to do with my life and spend most of my time doing that makes me happy and fulfilled, right? And gives me the lifestyle that I'm comfortable with, right? And if we could help create a nourishing environment to sort of nudge people along that path, it becomes a lot easier. But that was not the case for most of us. It definitely wasn't the case for me. So that was a huge stressor. And I think over time, you increase, that stressor goes up and down with the pressure consistently going up to perform in school. And, it winds up being quite the pressure cooker.
So what are the, I guess, common causes? You mentioned one, bullying and having these expectations. Now, I've read so many different things about, letting go and meditation. Like, when you actually want something and you focus on that, you're telling yourself, you actually create stress, and you're blocking, as you were saying, the ability for you to think more clearly by actually focusing on those things, letting go. But what are some of the common causes of stress?
Well, I can break it down in a really reductionist sense, if you like. Yeah. It's basically overstimulation, right? So we are a sense organ. Our bodies, our minds, the entire thing that is you and me, we are all sense organs. We sense everything coming in: sound, light, taste, smells, vibration, touch, and other things, right? Cold, temperature, hot, cold. We're sensing all these things all the time. Spatial awareness, right? So when you think about these things all happening around us all the time, then you pile on tons of responsibilities like emails and work and kids and family responsibilities and you name it, right? The news, right? You just think about all of that, getting piled onto all of the other stuff, and without taking the time intentionally, where we prioritize recovery as equally to prioritizing the time that we spend performing all the time and outputting. If we don't prioritize the time where we take back in, we recharge our batteries, we will burn out.
Yeah.
There's absolutely, with no question about it, it's just a matter of when, it's not an if, right? You have to restore the batteries. We have to prioritize the replenishing things that we do for ourselves, as well as the performance things. And the way this ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how did we get here, right? Is how did I get here? Is really about, me going to my dad one day. I think I was in 10th grade. We were on a family vacation in Mexico or something, around the beach. And he says, son, you're in 10th grade. It's time to start thinking about what you want to do with your life. And I was like, Dad, I want to study consciousness. I want to study dreams. I want to figure out how the brain works and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, son, I know that sounds fascinating. And I know that this is coming from an ophthalmologist. He's
Right.
like, I know this sounds fascinating. And he also is fascinated by the brain. And he was very encouraging of this line of thinking, but he's like, it's going to be hard getting a job doing that. That's a tough research field. So maybe you should spend some time, if you're really interested in doing this, spend some time in the lab, spend some time working with doctors and who are in this space, and see if that's something that you actually want to do. So I did that, and I spent a bunch of time in the lab. And he also encouraged me to pursue medicine, because having shadowed doctors in the past and having spent some time with my parents, it isn't, being able to work with vulnerable people and help them heal is one of the most rewarding things that we can ever do as human beings. And we all can do it in our own way. But being able to do it from the standpoint of being a medical doctor is a true privilege, and it is something that is very, very important and rewarding at the same time. And so seeing the reward that my parents got from that, and the gratification from doing that, and the fact they were able to earn a reliable living doing it, right, in terms of practicality, I made the decision, and after shadowing, I made the decision that I wanted to go to medical school, but also just kind of do research on the side, because doctors can do research, and there's actually nothing stopping us from doing research. It used to be part and parcel of becoming a doctor, was that research was something we all did. Now that's not the case anymore, because everything is moving towards efficient patient care. But as a clinician, I was working on chronic stress, and I have been working on chronic stress in the lab with Sally Temple, who is one of the leaders in the space, and one of the people who discovered that there are dividing neurons that still exist in the adult brain, which is not known before, and hence the term, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That is not true, and we now know, in part because of her work. And so I worked with her on neural stem cells and aging and neurodegeneration and chronic stress on the cellular level, with looking at disorders of dementia and aging blindness in humans. And then from there realized that that I had a really good psychiatry rotation. One of my good friends was very much into psychiatry, and she just kept telling me, Dave, you make a really good psychiatrist. And I really enjoyed my time doing psychiatry, and so I just started to spend more time doing it. And and then she sent me a bunch of papers on the psychedelic medicine research that was going on in psychiatry. And I read those papers, and they were just some outstanding science. Like, it was just really high quality science. And the results were unequivocally good, showing that psychedelic medicine delivered properly was inducing radical shifts in consciousness for people, and radical shifts in meaning, and radical shifts in sense of self, and therefore symptoms. And seeing that pattern, even in 2012, I was like, okay, this is it. This is the opportunity to actually study what I've always wanted to study, and be able to practice medicine in the way I've always wanted to practice all at once. I'm making the decision. I'm gonna move from neurology, ophthalmology to psychiatry. And then that became the journey that led to Apollo and all the psychedelic research and practice we're doing.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into that. Just a comment, because I had a similar thing with my parents. I wanted to be Rick Rubin. I wanted to be a music producer, and my parents actually had an intervention. They called their psychiatrist friend, and they all got together and told me that I will never make any money doing, I don't even know what Rick Rubin did at that time. I just thought it was cool to be a producer. I don't know what it meant. to go to college for physical therapy. So they all had an intervention. So I went to physical therapy school instead and never worked a day in my life as a physical therapist. But I learned a lot about anatomy and physiology and all that stuff
Right.
where I can use today. But I find, so why psychiatry and not psychology? Because there's a pharmacology aspect to that, and then there is a therapeutic aspect to the other one. Why? Because you're already in medical school and you thought that this was a path that led to more of a intervention and prevention than psychotherapy.
So I actually do psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is the majority of my practice. I'm trained in and practice in about 10 to 12 different forms of psychotherapy. So it's really more about sort of the tiers of training, in that if you're already in medical school and you've gone through the rigor of the American medical student training system to become a medical doctor, then if you want to study mental health, the path would be to pursue psychiatry, not to go back and do like a 6-year psychology degree. So psychiatry would be the path, but also as a psychiatrist, part of why I went to medical school was to keep my options open in terms of being able to work with people conversationally, psychotherapeutically, and also with medication, right? Because the two combined work better than in each individually alone. So having the ability to use both, to study both, optimizes the chances of getting better results, which indeed it does. And so being a psychiatrist got me psychotherapy training. I'm not as I don't have as many years under my belt as many psychologists do, but I understand and have practiced psychotherapy for many years and can deliver it very effectively, to the point where, it's over 50% of my practice are not actually needing medication prescription on a regular basis, because psychotherapy works, even without drugs.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. It makes total sense. I want to dive into a little bit on heart rate variability and just understanding, how does heart rate variability, how does it affect health span? Because people throw around these words all the time, and I have a bunch of biometric devices, that HRV and my HRV, but nobody, it's very difficult to find somebody that really understands, all right, this is baseline, this is where I should be, and how does it really affect, why am I measuring this in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. So HRV, to start, stands for heart rate variability, which is the rate of change of our heartbeat over time. So what that means is that if our heartbeat is 60 beats per minute, which is what we often think of as a standard heartbeat for the average person, that does not mean that there's the same 1 second between each beat. What it means is that sometimes there's 900 milliseconds between beat 1 and beat 2, and maybe there's 1050 milliseconds between beat 2 and beat 3, and it changes every time we move, every time we breathe, every time we effectively increase in any way the vascular resistance of the lungs. It puts pressure back on the heart. And so that is changing dynamically all the time, our beat to beat variability. And the reason why that's an important number, and it was discovered through biofeedback and the studies of biofeedback over the last 50, 60 years, that this is important, because what we've seen in biofeedback is a technique that is where you hook somebody up to an EKG heart rate monitor and a respiratory monitor, and you, at the most basic level, you show them the rhythms of their heart and their lungs breathing on the screen, and you say, and breathe basically to match the rhythms, and they breathe to match the rhythms, and within 90 seconds, 95% of people sync their rhythms, and when they sync their rhythms, they feel better. And their heart rate, and when they feel better, their heart rate and their breathing is somewhere between generally 5 and 7 breaths per minute. And that is a state that we start to enter that the body enters to facilitate access to meditative states, which is also happens to be a high HRV state. That state of high heart rate variability, HRV, is important because that correlates with maximal adaptability or resilience or recovery. So doing activities that result in recovery that don't stress the body, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, deep breathing, soothing deep breathing, soothing music, massage, technologies like Apollo, and doing things that make ourselves feel good, getting lots of sleep as a priority, right? All of these things boost heart rate variability, and heart rate variability goes up as a measure of our body being more recovered.
Got it. You mentioned getting more sleep. Is it more sleep or better quality of sleep? And do genetics play well? And I'll ask this question this way. So our former president, Donald Trump, used to pride himself on sleeping 4 hours a night. Maybe that works for him if he's in deep sleep, but 4 hours is a very low amount. I'm very conscious of my sleep. So on the average, I get somewhere around 6, and people are like, oh man, you need 8 hours a night. I said, well, when I measure my sleep, I'm not measuring just the length of sleep, how long I sleep, but what am I getting? Like HRV, all the things that you mentioned. And there are genetic predispositions and quality of sleep. Like I have a predisposition of bruxism, grinding my teeth. And when I am stressed, whatever I do during the day, it comes out at night during my sleep. And Apollo's been extremely helpful. And I'll get into that too, how I'm using it. And you can coach me a little bit on what I'm doing right or wrong. But is it the quality of sleep, or is it length of sleep? Because there's so many different like
quality.
Michael Bruce is on your board, who I know really well too. And I've had this discussion with him many times, sleep specialist and sleep doctor and all that stuff. And he's like, look at your states of sleep, look at your alpha and your theta and your delta and all those things, and dive deep. But is there a shortcut? Like how do people know what they should actually do? Is it more of a personalized thing?
It's definitely more personal on that spectrum. I think that to answer your first question, it's definitely about quality. Michael and I would definitely agree on that quality over quantity is absolutely the most important. I slept for 6 hours or less for probably several years, but I taught myself through breathing practices primarily, to drop in to sleep very quickly. And I think the hospital training helped with that too, to get sleep whenever I could. And so I was able to learn and train my body to get, what I felt, basically I felt the way I knew that I was getting what I wanted to get out of that. And that I wasn't like killing myself and feeling like crap every day, is that I wasn't feeling like crap every day. I was feeling rested. Right. So I think if it really comes back to self-awareness and training our breath, even just taking a few moments every day to start, just to think about the feeling of the air coming into our lungs as we intentionally take a breath, and then out, and then a couple more times, even if we just do it a minute a day, that is training our self-awareness to be aware of how good or how not good we feel, which is measured by HRV. You don't need HRV to tell you how good or not good you feel, right? You don't need your HRV to tell you how rested or unrested you were, and you don't need an Oura ring to tell you how much sleep you got or not, right? Those things can be helpful to map trends over time. I have an Oura ring. I use it to map trends month to month, which really gets into the consumer conversation around HRV, which is that HRV is a really fascinating metric, but all the things that we're talking about apply to HRV measured in the lab, right? That's controlled clinical research. When you go out into the real world using Oura rings, Apple Watches, Whoop and other things, there's a certain level of quality of data that the Oura Ring and Apple Watch hit that's pretty good. And then everything else is below that for the most part, in terms of the watch-like wearables or watch and rings. But when you get to even the best, which are Apple Watch and Oura Ring, amongst the best, you still have to trend your data over time. And time means looking at your trends of data, meaning looking at your sleep data, looking at your heart rate and your HRV, resting heart rate and HRV, which are the three most important data points for any of us, and trending those over the course of weeks to months. And as you trend those over weeks to months, you'll start to see trends either up or down. And as you start to see those trends go up or down, you want to make sure that you trend in the right direction. But looking at it with higher resolution than that is prone to error, because the devices have a lot of variability, which most people don't realize.
So how does working with your wife affect chronic stress?
I mean, I think it actually reduces it to a large extent because number one, we tend to not step on each other's toes because we have different activities. And we like each other, so we enjoy spending time together. And if we were further apart all the time, we wouldn't get that much time together. So overall, it's for us, it's, we're best friends. It's been really fun to work together and to do this project together and to help so many people feel better and feel more in control of their lives. And
I was asking more in jest, and that's a great answer, but
no, it's not without challenges, right? Because we never stop working. Right. So the thing is, if you have a job, or even if you're in a startup and you go home to someone or you go home to a place or an environment that does not have anything to do with work, you're going to have a little bit more balance than we have. And so for us, I think the biggest challenge is just forcing ourselves to maintain balance and to keep each other accountable and keep each other in check, because then that makes sure that we're both happy and healthy and sustaining our own recovery in a positive way.
So explain to me like how this came about with your wife and how you started thinking about Apollo in the first place, because all the things that you've done before led you to that, and then it's a device. So how did that even come about?
So I was working at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Psychiatry. I was seeing a lot of patients with PTSD and addiction and depression, but mostly PTSD, a lot of whom were veterans. And these people were on sometimes 5, 10, 15 medications, and they were not doing well. And we ended up having to take many of them off their medications and to do, intensive psychotherapy work. And many of them started to do better. And we started, and so it was curious to me seeing these folks, because as I started to see how poorly some of our treatments were working for some of them, other people were benefiting, but there were large groups, sometimes in some cases with PTSD, it was over 50% of our patients were not doing well with the medications as prescribed and the psychotherapy as prescribed. And so it just got me thinking, and I was doing research in the lab at the time on the safety and fear response in the brain, and looking at chronic stress and how chronic stress impacts our fear center and our safety center and our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and looking at all the different techniques that, like breathing and yoga, and basically looking at the chronic stress. I went from looking at chronic stress on the cellular level as we age to looking at chronic stress in the whole body when I was started at the University of Pittsburgh. So that was a big shift. And seeing these patients, especially the veterans who had these incredible skill sets from training and being in the military for so many years, come back to the civilian life and struggle so much, was really heartbreaking. And it was really challenging, but also inspiring, because it was a challenge of, how do I figure out how to help these people who have so many skills, but have forgotten how to use most of them, to remember that they have them and feel empowered enough and trust themselves enough to use them, right? Which is it's a very different approach than we take to the average non-veteran patient who doesn't have those skills, because they have never necessarily learned how to do the kinds of things that we're talking about. And yet these people are so traumatized, they were never not afraid. Right? In the whole time, sometimes years that I would see these patients, I would never see them not afraid. Shoulders up, sweaty palms, just crunched, right? Fearful body posture, all of these things. So that led me to look at all the research around and start reading on autonomic nervous system dysfunction in PTSD, and trying to understand what's going on in the body, what's going on in the nervous system, in our stress response, what's going on in our safety response, our recovery nervous system, and our vagal system. When we are under threat, when we're experiencing PTSD, can we measure it with HRV, right? Maybe there's a measure here that's interesting that we can track over time. HRV started to surface in the literature. And so then we started to say, well, what boosts HRV? Now, what do we know boosts HRV? Meditation, mindfulness, deep breathing, yoga, soothing touch, soothing music, empathy, right? Empathic communication, Calming things generally that stimulate the safety system of the body, activate and allocate resources to the parasympathetic system, which allows for recovery to actually happen, right? So seeing that pattern start to unfold, it became very clear that there may be an opportunity to use technology that we have available today to deliver some of the benefits of soothing touch, which is the oldest form of felt safety in mammals. It's hundreds of millions of years old. So the most ancient mammals have communicated safety to one another through infant-mother bonding, right, and holding each other. This has passed down to us. It's hardwired into us. So we ask the question, what if we could give people a wearable or some technology they could take home that would be easy to use, that would give them the sense of safety they get when they are having a one-on-one meeting with me and we're hanging out in the office and they feel comfortable to say anything that's on their mind without judgment, right? Can we give them that feeling in a wearable, right? And then because that feeling is therapeutic, that feeling is healing for people. It gives them the opportunity to feel safe being vulnerable. How do we help people feel safe being vulnerable? Vulnerability is that untapped wellspring of healing. So then if we can feel safe with it, we can work with it and we can actually make much more of it and learn a lot from ourselves with it. So that was the challenge. And as we started to play around with that, we realized we could actually do that. And then we ran the trials and we actually did it.
Yeah, I think it's great. And for me, I love the ability to modify the intensity because sometimes it's too much. Like I'm focusing on the stimulation, and for people that don't know, we can describe it. You can describe how it works, but for me, there's a vibration. Basically, there's a certain vibration, a certain pattern of vibration that you can turn on based on what you want to do for sleep. Maybe something calming, and you have different variables to that. But for me, it's as you said, it's a personal experience. Sometimes I do want the extra vibration stimulation because I have other things going on and I need to focus. Sometimes it's the opposite. Now I'm too focused on the vibration and it's actually distracting me from, my meditation or just my normal breathing. So those variables, I think, are really fascinating, the way you included that in the design.
Well, you use it exactly as it was meant to be used.
Oh,
so nice,
okay.
nice
Well,
work.
there you go. I didn't read the instructions. I'm the worst at doing that stuff. I was
That's
wondering
exactly what the intensity is for.
Perfect. So, okay, got it. In your research, I'm just curious, you talked about HRV and you see patterns of people doing better. Did you measure, or is there a measure of neurochemistry? Like, we know that there's cortisol release when we're stressed, and like maybe there's anandamide levels that are released based on, are getting some euphoric feeling, not just for consuming, phytocannabinoids, but I mean, our own endogenous endocannabinoids, endorphins, things of that nature. Have you measured, or is there a plan to measure, or is there something that we can look forward to in the future that we can say, yes, patient-reported outcome, yes, we have a biomarker, but maybe there's something on a neurochemical front that we can actually start measuring for consistency?
Yeah, there are lots of things you can measure. We have not completed any trials that have looked at cortisol or other neurochemicals yet because they're very expensive and they take a really long time to run. But we do have a big study that's going on at the Denver VA currently that is a VA-funded study of Apollo in veterans with PTSD, looking at blood biomarkers and epigenetic biomarkers. So amazing. That is, and including cortisol and many, many other inflammatory biomarkers. So that will be very, very exciting to see that come back. But that being said, while that's fascinating on a mechanistic level to understand what's happening on the neurochemical level, you can actually predict very, very clearly in most cases what's happening on the neurochemical level, because we know what happens when you take a deep breath, and we know what happens when somebody holds your hand, right? So by thinking, and we know what happens when you enter a meditative state, we know what the brain does, and we know what the heart and lungs do. And if we know what the heart and lungs are doing, then we can use that to very quickly extrapolate, okay, well, we know that when the heart typically slows down and the breathing gets deeper and longer, almost invariably in states of general safety situations, when that's happening, the inflammatory markers go down almost 100% of the time. So, is it interesting to spend a couple $100,000 to look at those? Absolutely, we're doing it.
Oh, you think you're going to get away with couple $100,000 to do that?
As a start, right?
It's going to be a million. And the reason why I ask is because we have a DNA company and we work with a lot of veterans, and we do genetic predispositions. And now we're looking at epigenetic and biomarker and all that stuff. And we work with veterans, and we can see all the things that you said. And people have asked us the same thing. Well, how do you know on a cellular level? So now we're tying in some methyl groups and from your epigenetic expression, to mapping them to people who are predisposed to stress reactivity and PTSD, and there's genes associated with that. So now we're suggesting an intervention and seeing what the outcome is. So there's a couple of different interventions, and I'm sort of going in this direction for a reason. We started focusing on the endocannabinoid system originally, and we can see that some people do really well with certain types of cannabinoids and terpene profiles, and actually reduces stress and increases heart rate variability. Some people, it's the complete opposite. The narrow therapeutic window of delta 9 THC, the binding affinity, and then you have these free radicals in your body. Even sometimes you have vagus nerve stimulation that stimulates other factors. So, and then the other thing that we started seeing is with some of our veterans, they started looking at psychedelics like psilocybin mushrooms, and I know that you've been involved with MAPS in certain ways as well. So I'm curious about this correlation between psychedelics and assisted therapy with psychedelics, and what is happening and how that correlate with Apollo. And there's a way to measure some studies that maybe MAPS is doing with even MDMA or ketamine or things that are going to be illegal. I know that psilocybin is still sort of on this cusp of legal in a couple of states, or tolerated. But I wanted to understand if you have any thoughts or plans to start correlating some of these other psychedelic, and I include, by the way, I include cannabis as a psychedelic too.
That's
some
fair.
people don't, but
That's
fair.
Fair.
I do. As I put in that.
Yeah, I think cannabis falls into the psychedelic category in general. It is mind revealing to people. It does alter consciousness. So I think that's fair. You actually brought up something that is one of my favorite things to talk about, which is, because I am a mechanism guy. I like to figure out how things work. So a big part of building Apollo was also understanding how therapy works, right? Why is therapy effective? And when you really look at why therapy is effective, psychotherapy, therapy that involves a doctor or a clinician and a patient, therapy is effective because the clinician and the patient have a relationship, right? There is a trusting bond, what we call the clinician-patient alliance, where the patient feels that they can trust that the therapist, clinician, is on their team, and that they're not judging them, and that they can say whatever they want in the safe space that is the therapeutic milieu, the environment, right? So that, when you look at all therapeutic modalities across the board, even in physical medicine, this is critical to people achieving good outcomes, particularly in mental health. So this really, and when you looked at our people with PTSD, our veterans with PTSD, and other non-veterans with PTSD, it was very, very clear that their body was saying, our fear response is out of whack. Our fear response is totally out of control. We need counterbalance. We need safety. We need to restore the balance and the force, right? That's what their bodies were saying from the data. So we said, okay, well, what if we look at safety? And when we look at what psychedelics do, because around this time, I was also getting my MDMA assisted psychotherapy training and my ketamine psychotherapy training. And it was, we were talking about with my colleague Ben Calmendi, actually, who I'm chatting with later today, about how we need to figure out better ways to assess what is happening to people when they're experiencing on the mechanistic level, on the neuronal level, on the tracking level, that helps us understand biomarkers, right? That help us understand what's changing in the body when people go through these transformative experiences. when we have a patient, or 67% of a cohort of patients that go through 3 doses of MDMA and 42 hours of psychotherapy over 12 weeks, and 67% of those people are no longer experiencing PTSD symptoms criteria after 1 year out with no additional treatment. We need to know, and those patients deserve to know, what the heck is going on in their bodies when that transformation occurs. That is a wild transformation. These people had over 17 years on average treatment-resistant PTSD, nothing worked. And then they have these results, right? They had lost complete hope that there was anything that was going to, at this point, for most of them, that was going to do anything to change their lives. And it did, right? So there's, and the reason it did, just to conclude on that, on this point, is because the medicine is neurochemically, biochemically amplifying the sense of safety that the therapist, clinician, and this trusting bond between the therapist and the clinician that has been built in advance of the medicine experience. Right.
That is the best way I've ever heard anybody explain that. So I'm going to ask a very long-winded question, because I've ADHD or whatever, and I have this bits and pieces, but I'm going to try to ask it this way. So
do you mind if I add one thing before you ask it?
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No worries. The last thing I just want to add is Apollo was developed as a wearable safety device in the way that it delivers vibrations that make the body feel safe, like soothing touch. And so it too was built to replicate some of the effects that we saw that MDMA was amplifying molecularly, but through the sense of touch. So that's how Apollo tunes in. And we're measuring both of those epigenetic outcomes in studies currently.
It's amazing.
To compare.
It totally makes sense. And I like the safety aspect. So I'm going to try to ask the question this way. We work with athletes, for instance, and athletes are very similar to veterans. I had this one athlete who's a lineman, 300 pounds, 6'6", and saying, when there's 300-pound guys running at him, sense of calm, no stress. I know what I'm doing. When he's at home, the birds are chirping, the windows, stress. He's stressed. And it's like, it's an interesting, you would think, wait, you're in a calm environment. What's happening? Because you're so conditioned to be able to, experience that, because it's second nature to you. And one of the things, like, I took a class with Stephen Kotler, flow class, and he was talking about, when you're in flow, what is that flow? What are your flow triggers? So understanding what specifically works for you, maybe for this athlete, he was in flow while he was playing, so he wasn't really thinking. Now, listening to guys like Andrew Huberman, Dr. Huberman, he talks about, cold and hot. So this is why I'm asking this question in a long-winded way. Even personal self-talk. Like, I was a big, proponent of Tony Robbins. I go to all his different events, and it's about having a self-talk. But one of the things I always thought about with psychedelics and therapies, it's not about turning things on, it's about turning things off. So I don't know if you can kind of substantiate my theory on this, that one of the things that happens is when you're consuming these, these different substances, it's really allowing you to turn off all this different stimuli that's going on, and you can kind of maybe be in flow, if I can use that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that theory.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. In some ways, it's also turning some things on and turning other things off at the same time, right? So it's turning on our awareness, it expands our awareness, but it turns off or turns down our sense of ego self, right? That defensive, I need to protect myself voice in our heads that's always going off, or going off a lot of the time, it turns down that in the right environment. It has to have the right environment. The environment prepares the body to feel comfortable to allow that to come down. And if the environment is not safe, that's when people can have unpleasant psychedelic experiences or altered state experiences. So the safety of the environment and therapeutic milieu and the cultivation of that, even just being around people that you trust, who you know are going to take care of you no matter what, can be enough in many cases to just make sure that you're going to have a good time, and that whatever comes up could actually be very transformative for you.
Yeah, that's why they say set and setting are a key to a psychedelic experience.
Right.
Makes total sense. What are your thoughts on cannabis as a therapeutic agent?
I think cannabis can be really helpful. It just depends on what you use it for. I think there's a lot of patients with PTSD that use it that tend to get really good results, and that's even high THC containing cannabis. There's a lot of people who use it for pain. I think if you look at the data, and again, just with my scientist, doctor, researcher hat on, you look at the data. You just want to look at the data, and we want to see, what does the data say? The data says that cannabis reduces opioid burden and it reduces benzodiazepine burden, and that's psychoactive cannabis and non-psychoactive cannabis alike. That's CBD dominant cannabis and THC dominant cannabis. I think that is a huge win in that we don't have any other really, really strong non-opioid tools that help to reduce the burden of opioids. I think within the 1 year, 2018, that dispensaries were introduced in a number of states, we saw a decrease in 4 to 5 million daily doses prescribed in that 1 year of opiates, right? So you think about the impact of that on society by even just unregulated, totally unguided use. It's pretty phenomenal. Imagine if we could introduce a little guidance to people and say, hey, maybe you'd be somebody who would benefit from CBD dominant versus THC. Maybe you need low THC, you need high CBG, high CBN, high CBC, right? There are hundreds of cannabinoids that we haven't yet explored even that are just truly therapeutic. And we don't even have the opportunity to investigate them right now because the clinical trials infrastructure is not supportive of that, but it's happening regardless in the real world. And I think there's a huge opportunity for cannabis to emerge as a powerful ally in this public health situation we're in right now.
Well, thank you for saying that, because you sort of indirectly promoted what we do at Endocanna Health and the DNA or DNA test for doing that. And our goal is to have, and you're absolutely right, clinical trials. I mean, we're in a few clinical trials, one in Harvard, one in Montreal, and et cetera, but it's the observational research. It's looking at what people are reporting and gathering that data and using machine learning to make better predictive inferences. And it's about, like, when we met with the FDA, for instance, they asked the purpose of our testing, we said to help people mitigate or avoid a possible adverse event. And most adverse events with cannabis are just people are taking too much and or poor metabolizer, different method of consumption. So, having a path for people to feel, I mean, you keep saying this, and I'm now going to start adopting this too. Safety is key for everything. And I think that's one of the major issues. And I remember even myself having, and I don't call bad trips, an intense psychedelic experience. It had to do with the setting that I was in, that I didn't have nature around me and I didn't feel that level of safety. So it had a complete different experience, still a learning experience where I took something away from that. But you're absolutely right. I really agree with you. Okay, so I have a few questions I ask all my guests, and real simple questions. I'm debating whether to ask you this question or not. I'm going to ask it anyway because it's not really the topic of conversation, but I'll ask it and you choose whether you want to answer or not. Please describe your first experience with cannabis.
I probably shouldn't answer that question.
Okay, let's move on.
I apologize. I can explain after.
No, that's fine. That's why I was hesitating to ask anyway. But it's out, so it's fine. So I'm a music guy. Obviously, if people can see, is there? Do you remember what the very first concert that you attended was?
That's a really great question. It's actually a funny question because the first concert I attended was with my parents. I was probably 8 or 9 years old. Oh yeah. Yeah, it was Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool.
At the Marin Civic Center.
Very cool.
Which was just absolutely awesome. I listened to a lot of folk music growing up, folk and classical and little jazz and show tunes.
Nice. What was the last concert you attended?
The last concert, it's actually been a while for any big concerts just because of COVID and work being crazy. But I did have the pleasure of going to see one of Jerry Garcia's old bands just a few days ago in Mill Valley at Sweetwater, which was unbelievable music. It was just the quality of like blues, jammy, funky blues, it was really outstanding. And, to just hear people who have just been doing this for so many years, it was so fun. And got some good dancing in, which I really needed because haven't been chair bound a lot lately.
There you go, man. That's you got to get out of your head and get out of that. That's a really great thing to advise people to just get out there. And music is like my therapy. I have to have music all the time. In that 2 years of being cooped up, I said I'm going to say yes to everything. So I go to all kinds of crazy shows. Is there anything?
Music is everything.
Well, I was going to ask
all about, even with Apollo. Apollo is music in a wearable.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's great. I love that choice. Is there anything that you're listening to these days that is interesting that you want to maybe recommend?
That's a good question. I've been listening to one of my good friends put out an album, Nick Chattel, Not an Airplane. It's called Galore Galore. It's an absolutely stunning album. Singer-songwriter, folk music. Really love that. I've been listening to that a lot as well. And a lot of jazz, a lot of funk. Sonny Rollins. Been going back to the classics, like Sonny Rollins, Mingus, and Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk, and a lot of those guys have been coming across, and then bridging into more of the female vocalists and getting into I'm forgetting the name of the artist, but like Walk On By, and getting more back into some, we've been listening, we went through a phase of last year, we're listening to a lot of like funky house music and disco house music. And so a lot of those songs now we're like going back to the originals, and we're listening to all the originals.
Yeah, because they used the samples of those. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and rehashing our connection to those, which is fun. Have
you listened to Kamasi Washington at all?
No.
The jazz guy. Yeah, I highly recommend. I just saw Kamasi. If sax player, I mean, phenomenal. I don't want to call anybody the second coming of Train or anything like that, but this guy, out of all the players, and Christian McBride on bass, saw him not that long ago. Fantastic player. So Kamasi Washington. All right. So final bonus question. Please describe what your room looked like growing up.
Oh, that's funny. What did my room look like growing up? A lot of Ninja Turtles. A lot of Ninja Turtles everywhere. Ninja Turtle bedspread, Ninja Turtle stuffed animals. I really wanted the Leonardo or Donatello stuffed animals, but they were out of stock when my parents got me them for my birthday, or went for my birthday. So I ended up getting the Raphael stuffed animal, which actually was the best one. It turns out in retrospect, because it was the biggest. But it was funny. So I had lots of Ninja Turtles stuff. It's funny the things you remember, right?
Right.
And then, it was just like my bed in the corner and hamper dresser. I had a built-in bookshelf that had a bunch of books. My parents filled my bookshelf with books that were like, some were children's books and some were books that were overflow from my dad's bookshelf. So I had lots of really weird stuff in there that was like electrical theory or thermodynamics, or like how to evaluate the curvature of the lens of an eye, or weird stuff like that, chemistry books and things. So I just started to like read through random things, just look at pictures, and I'm sure that helped. I listened to a ton of music growing up. I always had a cassette player by my bed, and I would listen to either Vivaldi or Vivaldi Four Seasons, or for probably like 3 or 4 years, Vivaldi Four Seasons, Peter, Paul and Mary, or what was the other one? Oh, The Magic Flute by Mozart. Every night before I went to bed, I would usually listen to one of those three. And then everything changed when I found my dad's Devo mixtape. And I threw that into my cassette player. I didn't really have my own like radio at that point, so I wasn't listening to like what was on the radio. I threw that in my cassette player and I was like, "Holy shit! What is this awesome music?"
That's it. Then you shipped into
that was
punk,
it.
and you're like the Clash and the Ramones and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yep, I went all the way.
You. Dave, I want to thank you so much for being on. Where can people dive more into your work? Where can they get an Apollo? Where can they engage with you? I know you're everywhere because all I have to do is put your name and you're all over the place. But share with the people, please.
Sure. You can come find me at socials. I always love to hear from you. I'm at Dr. David Rabin on Instagram and Twitter. I'm on Clubhouse at Dr. Dave Rabin, and we have a weekly or almost weekly Clubhouse recording of that you can participate in of the psychedelic news, which is called the Psychedelic Report. It's the first psychedelic news show, which is also a podcast coming out, and you can catch us there and even just come in and say hi. We always like to hear from you, so please reach out. And if you want to learn more about Apollo, you can check it out at apolloneuro.com. That's APOLLONEURO.com, or easier than that is even wearablehugs.com. It'll take you to the same place. And you can check me out at my website, drdave.io.
Great. Thank you so much again for being on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.